If you guys are ready to go, then we'll go ahead and get started. I'm Nathan Duffy, and thank you all for coming out today and joining in from home if you could. I am the owner of Midwest Natives Nursery in Lincoln, Nebraska, and we grow all Great Plains and Nebraska native wildflowers and grasses, all perennial plants. And we sell them retail and wholesale all over Omaha and Lincoln, and primarily for the purpose of supporting pollinators and doing what we can to reduce our resources in our backyards and help the environment. So I'm going to talk basically about that today, what native plants are, if you're not familiar, how do I know if a plant is native to my location, and then what those plants can do for pollinators and for the environment around us. A little bit about me, just to introduce myself. I'm originally from Bellevue, Nebraska, and grew up there, and came to Lincoln for college with pursuing a degree in horticulture. And I graduated with that in 2018 and started this business right off the ground. And it's been going really well, and we're growing wonderfully. And it's because of people like you that want to help out and add some natives to their gardens. So a little bit more. Let me get this. Oh, there we go. A little bit more about our company. We grow over 300 different species of, again, all native plants that are native to either the prairies or Nebraska specifically. And it's primarily wildflowers and grasses. We have just a few handful of shrubs, but no trees. We don't really do too much woody stuff. There are other growers around that do trees and shrubs really well. So we decided to focus pretty much on the wildflowers and the grasses. Again, all perennials, the things that die back down to the ground in the winter and then come up again in the spring. Everything we grow is a straight species, and we'll talk a little bit more in depth about what that means. But a straight species native plant is basically the truest wild version of the plant that there is. It is not in cultivation and hasn't been bred by humans for any particular attribute. It really is the wild plant from our prairies. We grow everything almost everything we sell, we grow locally right in Lincoln. We grow everything from seed. We start up in mid-February, and we have plants growing, all winter, and then we usually have our first sale by Mother's Day is what we aim for. A lot of our seed is actually locally collected right here in Nebraska. We have a number of suppliers around the state that either do produce, they have production plots where they grow some of these plants, but a lot of them are collected sustainably from wild populations that they know of. So that's one thing we're really proud of is keeping those local genetics, those plants from Nebraska here in Nebraska. And then of course, we're pesticide-free operation. We don't use any synthetic chemicals on the plants for the purpose of pest control. A lot of the bugs that we get, we want to keep. We get monarch caterpillars in there on our milkweed and all sorts of other different caterpillars and bugs, but all good things that we want, those are the things we're trying to support. So we don't go in and kill those things. If it means you end up buying a plant with a little bit of feeding damage on it, then we see that as a good thing. So of course, pesticide-free operation and for the most part, organic. So to the natives, what is a native plant, right? So a native plant is a plant that grew or still does grow wild in a location and has been since before European settlement. So for the last hundreds or thousands of years, these plants grew, basically evolved in a particular location, and with that have evolved relationships with the things around them, whether it be other plants or insects or animals. So they really are the true indigenous plants to Nebraska and to the Great Plains. So one comment we get, of course, is, I'm in a garden center and I'm looking at a plant I'd like to maybe get. How can I tell if it's native to my area? Because a lot of the time that's not going to be listed. Of course, if you come to our nursery, everything we sell is native to Nebraska. But if you're going around Mulhall's or Lanahas or Earl May and you want to know, is this plant native? One of the best things you can do if you've got a smartphone and you've got Google on there, Google the name of the plant, and then just put USDA after it. The name of the plant plus USDA. And USDA has a great database. Every plant in the country, they have documented not only whether or not the plant is native, but as you can see this map here on the left, they will actually show you those green squares. Every one of those is a county where the plant has been found native to live in. So these maps are really great, and you can get to it. You can get to it through Google or the website's right here, plants.usda.gov. Search the plant name in there, and then these range maps are really nice, helpful to see. And the fact that they go down all the way to county level is actually really important when talking about natives. You always want to qualify the word native when you can. So it's one thing to have a plant that's native to the United States, but where in the United States? The United States is pretty big. If you just are growing a plant in your garden that's native to the United States, well, that could be Florida or California or New York, or it could be Nebraska. These, we all the states have different ecosystems. And so when you really want to say as much as possible, native to the Great Plains or native to Nebraska, or even more specific, native to Eastern Nebraska, because, of course, Western Nebraska is a lot different than we have it over here. Based just moisture level, elevation, the plants are different even in our state of Nebraska. So whenever possible, if you can get it down to a county level and say this plant is native to Sarpy County or Douglas County, that's always really good information to have. So a straight species, like I mentioned before, it's just the actual wild plant. It has not been bred by humans for any particular attribute. And we'll talk about what it's called when a plant has been bred on the next slide. When looking around for natives, you might occasionally see the word variety. And variety it also means straight species, but it means a plant has been found, a population of plants has been found, and they have just slightly different characteristics than the rest of the population. Not different enough to warrant becoming a new species, but just different enough that they've had that little bit of added name to them. So one really common example, you may be familiar with dwarf blue indigo, Baptisia species as a landscaping plant. Baptisia australis is the regular blue indigo, and Baptisia australis variety minor is the variety. So they actually are the same species, but the smaller variety was found naturally in the wild, and somebody collected seed from it and began growing it. So it wasn't bred by humans to be shorter, it just naturally was, and someone found it, and therefore it's a variety of that plant. So now we're on to cultivars. A cultivar is a plant that has been bred by humans. And that word cultivar is just short for cultivated variety, meaning it has been purposefully cultivated by man. A lot of the time, plants are bred to be shorter or a little bit more compact, or reduce their aggressiveness or their spreading habits. And then of course, flowers are almost always, any cultivar almost always flower color and shape. Those are the big sellers when they're in the nursery, and you see a cone flower that's red or white or yellow. All these down here in this bottom image are cultivars of the same plant, regular purple coneflower, and the native image being up here on the top. So these have all been bred by man. Those didn't come out naturally like that in the wild. They were created. And the way you can tell, again, you're shopping through a garden center and you want to know, is this plant I'm looking at a cultivar? Dead giveaway always is if they have a name after their scientific name, if they have some fancy name in quotation marks, that is actually the trademarked name. It's actually a patent. You can patent a plant. All cultivars are patented. Somebody owns them, and they're given a name in quotation marks. So Echinacea purpurea, Cheyenne Spirit is a really common one. And there's cultivars for all sorts of plants, of course. But when you see any sort of name in quotation marks, that's a cultivar. It has been bred purposefully by man, and it's not actually the wild plant that you may be looking for. So should I plant cultivars? As I mentioned, we don't grow or sell any cultivars at my nursery. We grow all straight species plants. And that is because some problems do arise when cultivars are planted or bred. And primarily what that is when you really change the shape or color of a flower, these insects, the native insects that have been feeding from the wild version of that plant for thousands of years, they're used to what that plant is supposed to look like. They know what they're looking for. They know when it's supposed to bloom. And when you alter that, it almost makes that plant, insects may no longer even notice that that plant is there. To them, it is now something completely different. And so they, a lot of the times, will avoid it entirely. So a lot of research shows that cultivars don't get the same type of pollinator activity as the wild plant does. So if you're gardening specifically for pollinators and for helping the environment, the best thing to do whenever possible is go with the straight species wild plants and avoid cultivars. Nativar quickly is just, this is another word that has popped up recently, and it's just short for native cultivar. So your Cheyenne spirit echinacea would be considered a nativar because it is actually, it was bred from a native plant originally. Real quick, just to talk about invasive plants. The definition of invasive is a plant that is non-native, so it does not belong there and never did belong there, but that it is specifically causing negative effects to where it's growing. So it's either outcompeting the native vegetation, or it's displacing some sort of animal activity or insect activity. That makes it an invasive plant. Naturalized, on the other hand, is a plant, again, not native, doesn't belong here. It's been brought over, a lot of the times from Europe or elsewhere, but it's not necessarily causing bad issues in the environment. So dandelions in your lawn are a great example of that. They're not native to North America, but they're at the same time, they're not really causing any issues. They don't really tend to invade forests or prairie lands. They really like to hang out in lawns, and that's where they're happy, and they're not generally causing a lot of issues. So when that's the case, they're called naturalized. So real quick, just to mention, some people have experience with native plants being very aggressive, being very competitive, spreading around. If you've ever had goldenrod in your landscape, you've experienced this. And some people might even say that goldenrod is invasive, but just by the definition of what invasive means, that it's a non-native plant, no native plant can be considered invasive. So if you want to call it aggressive or competitive or a garden thug, that's fine. But you really should never refer to a native plant as an invasive plant because they're not. They're just doing what they're supposed to be doing that they would do in the wild. So why natives, right? Why do we want to put natives in our landscapes? One issue we have right now is the significant decrease in native wildlife. A lot of people started getting into planting for pollinators and planting for bees and butterflies when they started hearing about honeybees decreasing, colony collapse disorder. But what most people don't realize is that honeybees aren't actually native to North America. They're called European honeybees for a reason. And what people also don't realize is that there are over 4,000 different species of native bees that live in North America, and tens of thousands of other types of pollinators that live in our backyard as well. And things that you'd be completely surprised by: wasps, flies, ants, beetles, of course, your butterflies and your moths, but all sorts of different types of bugs can be pollinators. And so it's not just the honeybees we want to look out for. We want to plant a diversity of plants to provide for all of the types of pollinators that we can. Studies have come out just recently showing that half of those native bee species, that's 2,000 native bee species are in decline. They've been shown to be in decline. And about a quarter of that number are actually currently in danger of extinction. So we really do need to bring these plants back as much as we can. Everyone, of course, is familiar with the monarch. We know their numbers have been decreasing, but their number has actually decreased 80% since 1995. That's just my lifetime, 25 years. 80% of monarch butterflies have gone downhill. So they're really important to bring back. Too, it's not just bugs. A quarter of all of our bird species in North America have disappeared since the 70s. Again, that's one generation. And some studies come out recently, basically that they mapped the United States different regions. And actually the region that had the highest percentage loss of birds was the Great Plains. So right here in Nebraska, Iowa, Missouri, those states are losing birds more rapidly than anywhere else in the country. And that is very significant. So here's some photos I'd like to show of the different types of pollinators. Of course, you've got your monarch butterfly, swallowtail. There's a honeybee here on the butterfly milkweed, bumblebees. But some other things that, you don't necessarily notice a lot of the time are these little tiny bees, carpenter bees, sweat bees, flies, little fly here, ants, wasps, and of course beetles. All of these things pollinate our native plants. And these are the things that we need to be looking out for, not just the honeybee and not just the monarch butterfly either, but everything is in trouble right now. So planting natives is very important. Ultimately, we really do owe our existence to plants and pollinators. A lot of what we do on a daily basis, what we eat, what we wear, a lot of that is based on, derived from plant material, and a lot of that plant material is pollinated by insects. So of course we've got the food chain here with plant, you think of the food pyramid, for us it's bread and all that all the way up to the top, meat, protein at the top. In nature, plants is the base. And when you get rid of those plants, everything else up the food chain starts to suffer. First being your insects and birds. That's what we're seeing now. But shortly after that, when those start to disappear, you start to lose your bigger animals, your snakes and your foxes, and then, all the way up to things like the national symbol of our country, the bald eagle. You don't necessarily think of the bald eagle relying on plants for survival, native plants for survival, but it's because everything that they eat down the line goes back to plants. So what's causing these losses? Why are we losing so many birds and bugs? And it goes back to what I just said on the last slide. It's the loss of native plant material. 1% of native tallgrass prairie exists today. That is what's in our backyard, eastern Nebraska, all of Iowa, most of Illinois. That's tallgrass prairie. And unfortunately, 1% of it remains today. A lot of that, land over time being converted to farmland and urban places for people to live. And so that's where the big problem is habitat loss. Pesticide usage is significant as well, but it's not just pesticides being used on farmland. You wouldn't really realize it, but a lot of the pesticide usage in this country actually goes to lawns and landscapes. So urban environments, pesticide usage is significant, and that's affecting killing off native plants, and then also, killing off directly the insects that people don't like to see. Climate change is really important. As we get warmer and warmer, if we have a really early spring, that affects when native plants emerge from the ground. That affects when they bloom. And when those emerge times and bloom times are different than what the native insects are used to, the insects may not get fed at the right time, and they may not pollinate the plant at the right time. And when that mismatch happens, that can affect whether that pollinator survives or whether that plant survives for another generation. So if you get a couple of these in a row, especially of these early springs, that can really throw things off and affect pollinator populations. climate, increased temperatures also, they make the plants less resilient. They open them up to more pests and disease issues that can kill the plants off. And then, of course, just more extreme weather. When we have tornadoes and derechos in mid-December, that kills off plant material and can really harm environments. When we have major floods, that negatively affects native environments. So just overall, climate change is a big one. Invasive species, again, we talked a little bit about invasive plant species, but when they invade native woodlands and native prairies and they compete with that plant material for resources, and those native plants, maybe if they're not able to compete and they die off, then it's unlikely that they come back without help from us. So and then feedback loops, kind of like I mentioned with the early spring emergence, a lot of pollinators are dependent on certain types of native plants. And if the native plant disappears, the pollinator disappears. Or if the pollinator disappears, then the plant can't get pollinated and it's going to disappear. So everything's tied together, and one thing goes, everything else starts to kind of snowball behind it. These are some photos I like to show. Here on the left, this is a native virgin prairie, never tilled. It's on private land in Sarpy County. And as you can see it's kind of hidden up there on a hill. It's bordered on all four sides by corn and by farmland. And then this photo on the right is of a compass plant along a roadside here along the interstate. And of course, you can see all the cornfields in the background of it. But this really is, it's sad to see, but this really is that 1% that's left. It's roadsides and little tracts of land that people decided to save, 100 years ago. And we're so glad that they did, because that really that's the 1% that's left, is that little bit that was saved. So what I'm trying to do, and what I hope you guys are interested in doing, is bringing some of these plants back to your yards to help the cause. So overall, native plants, it's not just their flowers that help pollinators, right? Of course, we want to see adult monarch butterflies, and we want to see big fat bumblebees and honeybees. But without the caterpillars and without the larvae and the eggs, we don't get the adults. So, and all those stages of life have to eat something too. So we all know monarch caterpillars can only feed on milkweed plants, and it's essential for their survival. From egg to caterpillar to making their chrysalis to an adult, they need plant material to feed on and for safety as well. So we're all familiar with the monarch, but a lot of people don't realize that there actually are a lot of insects that have a similar exclusivity with their host plant. Swallowtail butterflies, for example, as gardeners, you guys may be familiar, they feed on things in the carrot family. So a lot of people plant dill and fennel and parsley for them, and they get with great success. So a lot of people have a lot of luck growing swallowtail caterpillars. But all of those herbs are actually non-native. They're cultivated herbs, and people don't realize that there are native plants that are native and wild in Nebraska that are in the carrot family and that feed swallowtails. Golden Alexanders being one of the most common ones that we sell. And then another example is fritillary butterflies. The regal fritillary is another really, really endangered butterfly that does reside in Nebraska. And their caterpillars can only feed on native violets. So the little blue and purple and white flowers that you may have in your lawn, those violets that a lot of people spray and think of as weeds, they're native plants, and they are the only plants that fritillary butterflies can feed upon. So just think about that the next time you're going through there and spraying for those. That's if you can leave those whenever possible, it's good to do. And that's just during the growing season, of course, but native plants also provide winter shelter for insects. and then other wildlife too, birds and small animals. We actually recommend that you do not clean up your gardens in the winter. A lot of people go out in the fall on, you know, the last nice day of the year and cut down their perennial gardens and you know, get rid of all the sticks and stems and dead leaves. But that's getting rid of the shelter that a lot of our insects need to hibernate and to survive the winter. Whether they are hibernating underneath the leaves or in the ground and the leaves are providing warmth on top, or a lot of native bees actually will nest in dead sticks, in the hollow stems. They will go in there and nest and survive the winter. So leaving that material as much as possible is really, really important. And then of course, native plants provide seed for birds. Migrating birds need that to get south. And then, you know, small animals and mammals, mice and rabbits, you know, use dead plant material in the winter to survive as well. So moving on from pollinators, native plants do a lot for the environment as well. And it's primarily due to their really, really, really extensive root systems. So this photo I love to show. It's an amazing example. Here on the left of the photo is the standard turf grass that you're going to have in your yard and how deep their roots are. I don't know if you guys can even see that in the back, but very, very small roots compared to our native plants that have in some cases, roots that grow 15 feet down into the ground. And we grow all of these different types of plants. Anything on here that you can see we have and grow. So but natives use those roots to clean the air and the water and the soil around them. So all that root mass is a storage for energy, and with plants, that's in the form of carbon. So plants store the CO2 that they bring in. They use that to survive the winter, to survive droughts, fire, all of that. But they store carbon dioxide, which helps with our climate change issue. All the little holes and pores in the ground that those roots create allows water to infiltrate, which reduces erosion, reduces flooding. You know, an acre of prairie can absorb something like 9 inches of rain in an hour. If we were to get that type of rain, a native prairie can absorb all of that with no flooding issues. Compared to a turf grass lawn, I mean, imagine if we got 9 inches, it would be a disaster. So, and of course, too, those deep roots bring nutrients from way, way, way down in the soil that bring nutrients up into the plant material, into the, you know, up into where it can be used by not only the plants, but other animals. And then in the case of native legumes, they fix nitrogen. So, you know, we're all familiar with soybeans being, you know, creating nitrogen in the soil. That's why we do crop rotations in fields. But native legumes do the same thing. They fix nitrogen out of the atmosphere, and they allow that nitrogen to be used not only by themselves, but by the other plants around them. So native plants literally fertilize themselves a lot of the time. Of course, again, because of these roots, you know, native plants really require almost no water ever, definitely no fertilizer. I've never fertilized any of my plants, you know. And then, you know, if you convert an area of lawn to natives, that's more area that you don't need to mow every week during the summer. And then native plants are super low maintenance. Like I mentioned before, we recommend you leave that material, the dead sticks and stems in the winter, and we go out in the spring, mid-April, maybe even early May, and that's the only time of year we do anything with our native beds. That's when we clean up. We cut the sticks down. We actually leave 12 inches is recommended that you leave, higher if you can, but 12 inches of those dead sticks, that material will persist and bugs can use that all summer and then into the next winter. And you don't even see that after long. After a month, the new plant has grown up through those dead sticks. So leaving them, you know, really is not even an eyesore after a couple weeks. In the home landscape, of course, as I just mentioned, native plants are super, super low maintenance, one time a year cleanup. They're extremely heat and drought tolerant. The worst possible spot that you could think of in your landscape, that area where nothing else wants to grow, they're called health strips, in between the strip of grass in between your street and your sidewalk, those areas where they just get hot and dry, and in the winter they get 6 feet of snow piled on them from the snow plow. All of that stuff. If you plant native plants in that strip, they just love it. Of course, because they're wild plants, they are really the most pest and disease resistant plants you could get. And then they're extremely diverse and adaptable. Like I said, we carry over 300 different species of native wildflowers and grasses. Again, that most of those are native to Nebraska. And so we've got bloom times, any bloom time from April to November that you can think of, we've got a plant for that time period. Winter interest, especially with native grasses. A lot of native grasses, people don't realize the fall color that they have. Little blue stem, big blue stem, Indian grass, just the beautiful red burgundy that they turn in the fall and hold all winter is just wonderful color for winter interest. All sorts of different bloom shapes and colors. Every color you could think of in the rainbow, we've got a flower with that. Different heights, we've got a number of ground covers from 4 inches tall all the way up to the prairie giants, the compass plant and cup plant, and the big tall grasses, things that get 6, 7, 8 feet tall. We have all of those. So any height you can think of or need, we've got. Sunlight amounts, of course, most prairie plants are full sun plants, but we've got a lot of partial sun plants and then a lot of full shade plants. People don't realize just how many actual flowers there are that bloom in full shade in Nebraska. So we've got shade goldenrods and shade asters, all sorts of stuff that people don't realize. And when they see what we have, they're like, oh yay, no more hostas. So a lot of different options for full shade. And then any soil condition, super wet, flooded, water year-round, all the way to super hard, dry, bone dry. There's a native for that spot, no matter what your soil is. And then clay, I get a lot of questions about, are these plants going to do okay in the horrible clay soil that I have? And the answer is yes. That's what they are used to growing in, being in Nebraska. So clay is not an issue. These are some photos of some plantings that are actually at my parents' house in Bellevue. All of these are there in their yard. And just showing kind of some different examples of how things can be planted. These are some different times of the year. These 4 here kind of in the middle are the same bed taken at different times throughout the year. Purple cone flowers, sunflowers, there's swamp milkweed and common milkweed. This is a big bee balm plant, Monarda plant here. This one up in the right corner is just a grass bed. And again, that's one spot that's really, really difficult. We could never get anything to grow there. It's on the east side of the house, right up against the house. Sun comes up till, gets full sun till noon, and it's just crazy hot and dry. But we put native grasses in there and they just love it. They absolutely thrive in that spot. This one is a newer planting we just did. This is actually the day of planting. So those are the shows kind of the small plugs that we plant. It's full grown now. And I do have photos of that, but nice circular planting around a tree in the front yard. And then this one is a full shade planting also in my same yard, but on the different side of the yard under a tree, full shade. So here's an example of, full shade goldenrod right here in the front. There's full shade asters here in the back. And they just thrive underneath the shade of a tree, all day, all summer. One question I get a lot, especially with the height that some natives can be. I mean, you can see here some, these common milkweed plants are, if this is a 4-foot fence here, they're 6 feet tall there. One question I get is, how do I plant natives and not have the neighbors, call the weed police on me? And that does happen. But what really, you have to plant with purpose. You have to really, you can't just go out and scatter things around and hope it looks good, because it's not going to look good. You have to, come in with some sort of plan and design. If you can go with similar colors, similar heights, that's always good. But one thing that's really, really important, I find, is borders. So especially right here, this is a front yard planting visible from the street, but just putting this nice ring around it, that brick border tells people, this is put here on purpose, right? This was planted for a reason. Um, this planting along the backside of the house is grass bed. Again, that border is really, really important. And whenever possible, I like to just plant up against a fence, up against your chain link fence, or, that's where you can add some of that height, especially, I like to put tall stuff up against the fence and, short stuff, keep short stuff together and do a border around it. So borders I find are really, really important, just to show your neighbors that, we're doing this for a reason. So finally, of course, we want to plant these plants in urban landscapes. We want to bring pollinators back to our backyards and to places where we live. But whenever possible, unfortunately, just planting in our urban landscapes may not be enough. So we always want to, whenever we can, get natives back into our wild spaces. That's our parks, our open areas around town, open spaces. If it's just a spot where there's turf grass and the city just comes and mows it once every other week, then what are we doing, right? If it's not being utilized for something and we're just wasting gasoline on it for no reason, then let's get some native plants in there, either by seeding or by doing a large planting with plugs. But bringing natives back into public spaces where people driving around town can see them and experience them, and at the same time, of course, help pollinators and all of that. That's really, really important. So these are all plantings that I've either done or worked on. These 4 here on the left actually are at the Bellevue Cemetery, the entrance to the cemetery. There's a big hill there, and it was just weeds and very difficult for the city to mow because it was such a big slope. So we went in and seeded and planted natives in there. And now it's just full of really nice native grasses and flowers all summer long. So that's one spot we've worked on. This photo here on the right is a big native planting out at our greenhouses in Lincoln. So again, it was just a big open field, but along a road that gets a lot of traffic. And we said, let's put some sort of planting here and kind of show the city of Lincoln what we can do. So again, yeah, whenever possible, if you've got any connections with the city or your local, the park behind your housing development, if you can get native plants going in there, then all the better. So that is everything I have. Thank you guys all for listening. And please, if there are any questions, I'm open to answering any questions. So I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording too there, and we'll